Nick Moretti did not know what jealousy was. He controlled empires, not emotions. He led meetings with men decades older than him, moved money across borders, and resolved matters with nothing more than a low, steady sentence. He was the kind of man people whispered about in upscale Manhattan restaurants, then pretended not to recognize when they accidentally brushed past him on 6th Avenue. He did not pursue anyone. He did not explain himself. And he certainly never paid attention to women, not until the night the woman who cleaned his penthouse stirred a feeling in him he could not name. Nick lived a life built from iron discipline and shadows. From the old brick streets of Brooklyn, where he learned that silence could be more frightening than gunfire, to the gleaming penthouse overlooking Manhattan's electric nightscape, every step he took was calculated, precise, never off by even a breath. Those who knew him either respected him or feared him. Those who did not know him heard the stories and stayed away. In the underworld, the name Nick Moretti never needed to be said twice. He was the man who never revealed an emotion, never softened, never wavered, never allowed anyone close enough to see the cracks beneath the frozen armor he had worn since he was young. And absolutely no one entered his most private space without passing through dozens of layers of security. Yet every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, the door of that penthouse opened for an ordinary woman named Emily Sanders. Nick did not notice her on the first day. A young woman around 28, small in build, her hair tied neatly back, no heavy makeup, no expensive jewelry like the women who tried to catch his attention. Emily bowed her head politely and distant, saying, "Good morning, Mr. Moretti," then quietly walked into the kitchen to check her task list. She asked nothing. She tried no conversation. She never looked him in the eyes. It should have pleased him, because Nick hated curiosity, hated noise, hated neediness. But Emily's silence was not the trembling silence of fear he was used to. It was calm, gentle, as if she had stepped into the most dangerous territory in New York, without knowing it was dangerous or worse, knowing and not caring at all. In the early days, Nick noticed her only because her presence shifted the rhythm of sound in a home accustomed to absolute stillness. The soft click of cupboards, the faint clink of dishes, the hushed sweep of a mop across marble floors, never rushed, never flustered, as if this were not the home of one of the most powerful men in the city. The first thing that drew his eye was not her, but the absence of things he expected from women. No attempt to impress, no heavy makeup, no practiced smile, no lingering glance in his direction. Emily worked as if he did not exist, and somehow, that was what began to make him notice. The first time he looked up from a stack of files and saw her wiping the ebony wood table, she simply gave him a soft smile and continued her work. She did not blush, she did not stumble, she did not rush away. There was a natural ease to her that was strangely unsettling. Nick was a man who only had to step into a room for every gaze to turn toward him, whether in reverence or fear. Women looked at him with hope or hunger, men looked at him with caution. But Emily did none of those things. She worked, finished on time, and left without a minute more. And that simple, almost irritating normalcy made Nick, a man who held life and death in his hands, want to know more about her. He did not want to admit it, but from that day on, he began watching her every step, a habit he would later understand was the beginning of a loss of control he had never known in his life. If you're still listening and feel that this story touches something inside you, take a second to subscribe to our channel, like the video, and share it so we can continue bringing you heartfelt stories every day. And if you don't mind, where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and tell us which corner of the world this story has found its way to. We treasure every word you share. Emily Sanders was unlike anyone who had ever stepped into Nick Moretti's living space. She did not have the hurried posture of professional staff who worked in multi-million-dollar homes, nor the cautious deference of those who had heard enough rumors about him to stay on edge. She simply appeared, wearing a simple white blouse, dark trousers, flat shoes, her hair tied high in a neat ponytail. She always carried a small canvas bag of tools, wore no perfume, no strong makeup, and never asked a single question. On her first day entering the vast penthouse atop the black stone tower in Midtown, her gaze paused for exactly 3 seconds on the antique clock in the corner of the living room. Then she looked at nothing else in the decor. When Nick happened to walk out of his glass office, Emily bowed politely. "Good morning, Mr. Moretti," then continued cleaning as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture. She did not meet his eyes. She did not seek a spark of connection the way other women often did. Emily looked elsewhere, spoke only when necessary, and revealed nothing. She dusted as though every marble countertop were part of a meticulous exam. Everything she touched became clean and orderly in a quiet, unassuming way. No noise, no attempt to please, no desire to be acknowledged, and she never once complained. One day, the chef forgot to leave her lunch portion. She simply drank water, finished her work, and left. No complaint. The next day, she returned on time. Rain, snow, the sharp winds of New York, or the news filled with reports of street conflicts, Emily still arrived, on time. Always at 8:30 in the morning, not a minute early, not a minute late. She greeted the security guard, nodded at the doorman, smiled softly at the elevator attendant, then slipped quietly into the private hallway leading to Nick's apartment. With others, she was gentle and approachable. With him, she kept a distance so cold it was almost unsettling. And the more she did it, the more it occupied Nick's mind. He did not want to admit it, but he had begun watching her more than necessary. What she did while she was there, which floor cleaner she preferred, the way she always stopped to wipe a speck of dust on the lamp's base even when it was already spotless. Some days, he sat in his upstairs glass office, his eyes unconsciously following her as she moved from room to room, quiet, precise, never dropping a thing. When she knelt to check the drain pipe under the sink, rolling up her sleeve, he found himself staring at the small curve of her wrist. When she laughed at a joke from the guard outside the window, the smile wasn't even meant for him, yet it struck his chest in a strange, unwelcome way. Nick despised that feeling, this floating, nameless, reasonless sensation that belonged to none of the rules he had built over more than 20 years of commanding power. He had once brought down rivals with a single look, forced Miami's biggest drug traffickers to bow their heads, and made senators in Washington tread carefully whenever his name was mentioned. But now, he was watching a cleaning woman as if she were the center of a map no one had allowed him to read. The quieter she was, the more he wanted to break that silence. The farther she held herself, the more he felt himself pulled toward her. Nick didn't understand why. All he knew was that the moment she wiped a streak of water from the window and the morning light slipped through her pale brown hair, casting delicate reflections across the marble ceiling, he could no longer tell where reason ended and emotion began. And that terrified him, because losing control was something he had never allowed in his entire life. That morning, Nick was standing on the second-floor balcony, an untouched espresso in his hand, his eyes unconsciously fixed on the front entrance. Emily had just walked past the security gate, her neatly tied hair catching a whisper of the early breeze, a light beige coat draped over her shoulders. She paused at the reception desk, said something to the young guard with the kind face, and the two of them laughed together. Not a polite laugh, but a real one, easy, warm, completely natural. A moment later, she looked up, waved goodbye, and stepped into the elevator as if nothing unusual had happened. But to Nick, that tiny moment felt like a pin pressed quietly into his chest. He didn't realize he had gripped the delicate porcelain cup so tightly that the rim gave a faint cracking sound. He didn't understand why it bothered him. It was only a smile, a greeting. A polite young woman speaking kindly to a security guard, nothing wrong with that. She didn't belong to him. She was an employee. He was the employer. So why did it feel like betrayal? Nick set the cup down and walked inside, forcing himself to dismiss the strange sensation. But from that moment forward, he paid closer attention. He asked Vin, the head of building security, about the lobby cameras, casually, as if checking whether the system was functioning properly. But in truth, he wanted to know exactly when Emily arrived, when she left, how long she stayed, whether she often spoke with that guard, whether she smiled at anyone else the way she had that morning. He refused to admit it even to himself, but his curiosity was shifting into something sharper control. He had never seen himself behave this way with anyone. Women came to him for money, power, reputation, or whatever fantasy they believed he could give, and when he tired of them, they left. No attachments, no complications. Nick had never cared where they went, what they did, or who they were with. But with Emily, someone he had never touched, never kissed, never invited anywhere, even the smallest detail of her day unsettled him. The morning she arrived 15 minutes late, he checked his watch 3 times. The day she left 5 minutes early, he asked Vin whether something had happened downstairs. Harmless questions, But after more than 10 years working beside him, Vin noticed the shift. "She's just a cleaning girl, boss," Vin said lightly, as they watched the footage together in the security room. Nick stayed silent. He knew Vin meant no disrespect. It was simply the truth. Emily was just the cleaning girl. But to Nick, she was no longer part of the background. She was the focal point of a feeling he could not control. Every time she smiled, even at someone else, his chest tightened. Every time he heard her footsteps in the hallway, he lifted his head, waiting. And when she didn't appear on time, the entire penthouse felt out of rhythm. The sensation irritated him not because it felt weak, but because it felt unfamiliar. Nick Moretti was not the kind of man who wavered over a smile or a greeting. He had walked past women 10 times more stunning than Emily, women bolder, more eager. Yet it was her quietness, her lack of effort, her complete indifference to attention that pulled him into a depth he had never intended to enter. One evening, when she left earlier than usual, Nick stood behind the glass window, watching her figure shrink beneath the streetlights, his hand clenched into a fist without him noticing. He didn't understand what he feared. Maybe she had plans with friends, maybe dinner, or a date. The thought brushed across his mind like a blade, slicing something tender he didn't know he possessed. For the first time, Nick recognized the terrifying truth. He was jealous. And even worse, he couldn't stop it. Night in New York was colder than usual, not because of the weather, but because of the stillness that seeped into the glittering streets. Nick stood in the shadows near the lobby, the hood of his coat pulled low, his back leaning, against a marble column like an unnamed specter. This was not something he did. He didn't lurk. He didn't wait. But tonight, that restless itch beneath his ribs drove him out of the penthouse. Emily had left early, telling the guard she had personal errands and wouldn't return, but the flicker of unease in her eyes unsettled him. And Nick, guided by an instinct he never questioned, knew something was off. When the revolving door spun open, Emily stepped out, walking quickly, a small bag in hand, her phone glowing in the dark. She didn't look around. She didn't know she was being watched from across the street. Nick followed at a distance, quiet, controlled. She crossed 2 blocks and entered a small cafe on the corner, where warm yellow lights washed over worn wooden tables and moss-green chairs. She sat by the window, checked her watch, and scanned the room. Minutes later, a young man appeared, a denim jacket, slightly messy hair, faded sneakers. His face lit up when he saw her, and he wrapped his arms around her. Not a polite embrace, not a courteous greeting, a real hug, close, familiar, intimate, in a way that landed like a punch beneath Nick's ribs. He stood frozen across the street, fingers tightening until his knuckles turned white. He couldn't hear them, but every expression on Emily's face was painfully clear. She laughed. She tilted her head, listening. She touched the boy's arm as she burst into another laugh. Each gesture struck Nick like a blow to a pride that had never known vulnerability. He didn't know how long he stayed there. Every minute felt stretched thin. Anger simmered beneath his skin. But beneath that, something worse. Disappointment. He had imagined something different. Something that wasn't real. He had imagined she was his even though he had never said a word to make it so. When Emily and the young man left together, Nick didn't follow immediately. He watched them walk side by side down the glowing sidewalk, just another pair of young people in the city. At the corner, Emily turned and hugged him again. She leaned in, whispered something, and they both laughed. The second hug lasted too long. Long enough that Nick had to walk away before he lost control of the storm building inside him. On the drive home, he played no music, made no calls, didn't look at his phone. The darkness in the car reflected the coldness in his eyes. He didn't know whether he was angry at her, at the young man, or at himself for caring this much about someone who was supposed to be nothing more than an employee. But the ache in his chest wasn't anger. It was loss. It was disappointment. It was jealousy. And jealousy, to Nick Moretti, was unacceptable. The next morning, Emily walked into the building with her usual calm and gentle gaze, untouched by worry. Nick was already in his office, and for the first time, he didn't pretend to be busy. He waited. When her footsteps crossed the marble floor, he spoke, before she could reach the kitchen. "Emily, stop." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that could halt a speeding truck. She turned, not startled, not frightened, just mildly surprised by his formal tone. Is something wrong, Mr. Moretti? He stepped around his desk, moving closer than necessary. Who was the man you were with last night at the cafe on 54th Street? The question landed sharp and cold, like a blade. Emily blinked, genuinely taken aback, then her lips curved into a faint smile. Were you following me? Nick clenched his jaw. He wasn't used to being on the defensive, nor being the one questioned. Answer me. She held his gaze longer than she ever had before. That was my brother, Noah. He just finished his midterm exams and met me to borrow money for his textbooks next semester. A heavy silence filled the room. Nick stared at her, searching for a lie. But there was none. Only a quiet steadiness, as if she had expected this confrontation, and had nothing to hide. He swallowed not from embarrassment but from anger. Not at her, but at himself. He had imagined the worst. He had felt jealousy like a knife. He had suffered over a stranger, only to learn that man was her brother, and worse, she knew it. Her soft smile wasn't smug, wasn't mocking, yet it made Nick feel as though someone had poured ice water over the pride he had spent a lifetime building. Your brother, he repeated. Just your brother, she nodded. He looks younger than me, so people misunderstand. We meet there once a month, nothing secret. Nick turned to walk away, but stopped halfway. His hand tightened, then loosened. Why didn't you say so? The question left him quietly, almost like a confession. Emily looked at him, tilting her head as if carefully choosing her words. Then she answered, her voice gentle enough to feel like reassurance. I didn't think you cared. We're not friends. I'm just the person. Who cleans your apartment, remember? Nick said nothing. Because anything he said now would reveal more than he was willing to show. The silence between them was no longer a wall, it was a door opening, exposing a vulnerability he had never allowed anyone to see. Emily turned away and went back to her work. But from that moment forward, Nick understood something had shifted. Not because of who she met, or who she smiled at, but because for the first time in his life, he had been forced into a place without control. For the first time, he had been humbled. And the person who brought him to his knees was not a rival, not another kingpin, but a cleaning girl, with calm eyes and a quiet smile that made the world he thought he owned suddenly feel fragile. From that morning on, Nick was no longer quite himself. He hadn't transformed into someone new, but something deep inside him had been touched, awakened, and he could no longer ignore it the way he once did. He didn't question Emily anymore, not directly, but his actions spoke louder than any interrogation. Within a single day, Vin received a direct order from Nick. From now on, every time Emily entered or left the building early or late, it had to be recorded in full detail. Nick offered no explanation. No one dared ask for one. A command was a command. It didn't take long for Emily to notice. She was not naive. On the third day after their tense exchange, as she was preparing to leave after cleaning the dining area, the elevator guard politely told her he needed to log her departure time. Emily tilted her head, a flicker of something unreadable shining in her eyes, before she gave him a small smile. I wasn't aware building policy required cleaning staff to clock out. Or am I a special case? The guard gave an awkward smile, saying he was simply following instructions. She didn't ask whose instructions. She didn't need to. And the next morning, when she entered the penthouse, she left a small, folded note beside the teapot he used every day. To Mr. Moretti. I will be present from 8:30 in the morning until 12:15 in the afternoon. If there are any changes, I will provide written notice with signature. Respectfully, Emily Sanders. The paper was folded neatly, placed like a government report delivered to a federal office. Nick read it in silence, folded it again, and tucked it into his drawer. But the shift in his eyes throughout the rest of the morning could not be concealed. She was playing back. Not with rudeness, not with rebellion, but with a sharpness so precise he could neither push her away nor ignore her. He began to notice her everywhere, not just in the penthouse but in his mind. Every step she took, every cloth she lifted, every breath she exhaled seemed to tap against a wire inside him he'd been trying desperately to keep still. She walked through the living room and left behind the faint scent of soap. She washed glasses in the kitchen, the sound of water trickling like it was filling the quiet spaces in his chest. Nick wasn't used to having anyone toy with his emotions, nor was he used to feeling like he was trapped in a game whose rules he didn't set. He was the one who created rules. He was the one who decided who entered and who was removed from his life. But with Emily, none of those rules applied anymore. He tried to put boundaries around her, through other people, through unspoken orders, through stricter observation. But in return, Emily only grew calmer. She didn't resist, but she didn't yield either. She walked into the penthouse each morning with the same faint smile, the same composed gaze, and a presence that made it impossible for him to tell whether she was challenging him or simply amused by the power he thought he possessed. One morning, she paused outside his office, looked him directly in the eyes after finishing her cleaning, and said in a voice gentle but edged with quiet precision, "I'll be leaving at 12:15. Would you like me to report each bathroom break to Vin as well?" Nick stared at her, and a moment later, the corner of his mouth lifted in a reflex he didn't fully understand. A rare smile, not because it was funny, but because he realized he had stepped into a game where he was no longer the one holding the upper hand. Emily bowed slightly, turned away, leaving behind a faint jasmine scent in the air. As the door clicked shut, Nick leaned back in his chair, eyes on the ceiling. The tension between them wasn't in arguments or orders, but in the silence and unspoken language brushing between them, charged with meaning. Neither dared to articulate. He considered ending it, terminating her contract, cutting the feeling off before it grew any deeper. But the moment the thought surfaced, it extinguished itself like a match in the rain. He knew the truth. He was far too late to turn back, and she somehow had stepped into the one territory of his life that no one had ever reached. Rain had started in the afternoon, but by nightfall, the city had vanished beneath a furious downpour. The skyscrapers disappeared behind sheets of white water, headlights streaked across the pavement like trembling reflections, and thunder rolled through the city like warnings for anyone still wandering outside. Emily stood before the wide glass window of the penthouse, her phone in hand. The road home had been blocked by a fallen tree. Taxis couldn't reach her. The subway was suspended. Outside, the wind howled like it wanted to rip the city apart. She turned toward Nick, who was sitting at the bar counter, lazily swirling a glass of whiskey without ice. "I can't leave." Her words pierced the thick tension that had been coiled between them for days. Nick didn't lift his head. He took a slow sip, set the glass down. "Then stay." She frowned, as if doubting what she'd heard. "Stay?" He looked at her for the first time that evening. His eyes, not cold as usual but deep, a quiet, shadowed warmth that unsettled her more than his harshness ever had. "Or do you plan to walk out at midnight, in this storm?" She didn't answer. She simply nodded, slipped off her wet shoes, and stepped barefoot onto the warm wooden floor. Later, close to midnight, her stomach growled softly, and she laughed under her breath, embarrassed. "I haven't eaten dinner." Nick was in the auxiliary kitchen, flipping through the chef's menu notes. He looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Can you cook?" Emily shrugged. "A few simple things." He pulled out eggs, cheese, and vegetables from the fridge. "So can I. Come here." She stepped beside him, rolling up her sleeves, washing her hands under warm water. The kitchen came alive for the first time. No longer a sterile space meant for a private chef. The warm light washed over her hair. The scent of melting butter filled the air. She chopped onions. He cooked the eggs. Their hands brushed, when reaching for the salt. A small pause so slight it barely existed, then the clatter of the knife filled the space again. Emily picked up a piece of egg, blew on it gently, and tasted it. Not bad. Nick gave her a sideways look, the corner of his mouth lifting. "When I lived in Italy, I cooked for myself. Even a Mafia boss still has a stomach to feed." Emily laughed, and the sound softened the storm outside. She looked at him not from afar, not from behind a cold pane of glass, but up close. Very close. Nick said nothing, but something inside him had shifted. She stood there, hair falling loosely, a porcelain plate in her hand, her eyes bright with the small, simple joy of sharing a meal in the middle of a storm. No makeup, no caution, no armor. And he, within walls that had always been a fortress, felt his heart unguarded for the first time. They sat together on the long bench beside the kitchen, plates warm in their hands, rain hammering relentlessly against the windows. Emily leaned back, eyes on the ceiling. "I never imagined a night like this eating scrambled eggs with a Mafia kingpin in Manhattan." Nick chuckled softly. "And I never imagined laughing because of a cleaning girl who insists on documenting every minute." Emily turned to him, her gaze glinting with that familiar edge of mischief. "So now I'm the cleaning girl who knows how to make eggs?" He nodded, his eyes half playful, half serious. "You're the first woman who's ever made me forget who I am." Her smile faded not from discomfort, but because in that moment, they both understood something had crossed an invisible line. They were no longer employer and employee, no longer separated by power or roles. Just two people, in the middle of a storm, cooking together, sharing silence, realizing that in the dangerous, artificial world they lived in, a night like this might be the most real thing either of them had felt in a very long time. The warmth from the scrambled eggs had long faded, yet the air in the kitchen still held the quiet, unspoken tension both of them felt, but neither dared to name. Nick leaned slightly to the side, his arm almost brushing Emily's shoulder as he reached for the bottle of water on the counter. She turned at that exact moment, and their eyes met close, impossibly close, close enough for him to see the reflection of the kitchen lights in the soft brown of her pupils, and for her to see the faint tightening of his jaw as he inhaled. A second passed, then another, and time seemed to freeze in that fragile pocket of stillness. Nick didn't think, didn't plan, he simply leaned in a little more, and Emily did not pull away. Their breaths brushed together, warm, carrying the faint sense of coffee and fried eggs. The distance between them was nothing more than a thin layer of air, but just as their lips were about to meet, the doorbell rang sharply, startling them apart like a jolt of electricity. Emily stepped back, smoothing her hair with a flushed face. Nick straightened, turning toward the security console. Vin appeared on the screen, tension in his eyes. A security alert from the ground team: a stranger had been spotted lingering near the building's technical entrance. Nick nodded, ordered a lockdown of the lower levels, then switched off the monitor. When he turned back, Emily was standing by the window, staring at the rain that refused to stop. The storm had softened, but the space between them now felt heavy with things left unsaid. She didn't ask. He didn't explain. But when Emily turned to leave the kitchen, Nick stepped closer, his voice low and firm. "Starting tomorrow, you'll have someone escorting you." She stopped, her brows knitting in confusion. "Why? This neighborhood is safe." Nick met her eyes without wavering. "Not safe enough for me." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded quietly, without arguing. But something in her gaze had shifted. The next morning, at exactly 8:30, a black SUV pulled up in front of Emily's apartment. A large man in a dark suit greeted her with nothing more than a nod. He spoke no unnecessary word on the ride. He didn't ask questions, didn't attempt conversation. He simply watched. Emily felt a chill crawl down her spine. She wasn't someone who lived in fear, but she had never lived with the sensation of being monitored. In the elevator to the penthouse, she began piecing things together. She remembered the request to report her comings and goings, the look the guard gave her when she smiled at him, the time she was told to wait downstairs for technical reasons, and now her own driver, her own bodyguard, an invisible system tightening its hold around her. When she stepped into the penthouse, she found Nick already waiting on the couch, hands resting on his knees, as if lost in heavy thought. She set her bag down, not smiling, not speaking, just watching him. "What's happening? Mr. Moretti?" He didn't blink. "You'll be safer with someone watching you. There are things happening out there I can't control." Emily nodded slowly. Out there. But she didn't ask further. She didn't confront him. She simply walked into the kitchen and began her usual work. But inside her chest, something cold and soft, a warning breeze moved through her, because she knew this wasn't just concern. It was control wrapped in the shape of protection. And the man who had almost kissed her the night before, who had admitted no woman had ever made him forget who he was also a man capable of making her lose herself if she wasn't careful. That weekend, the sky stayed overcast all day. Manhattan wore a thin gray veil that made everything seem slower, quieter. But in the building's security room, the monitors flickered nonstop, capturing every corner of the tower. Nick walked in without announcement. Vin stood immediately, tension etched into his face. "Something's wrong," Vin said, pointing to the footage. The screen showed Emily leaving a small grocery store in Queens the night before, her bag tucked under one arm, her thick coat pulled up to shield her face. A man stood in the shadows near the bus stop, turning his head as she passed. At first, it looked like a brief glance. But then he moved. When Emily crossed the street, he crossed as well. Not close enough to alarm her, but close enough to keep her in sight. He didn't touch her, didn't approach her. But there was something in the way he tracked her steps, in the practiced way his eyes followed her, that sent a cold ripple down Nick's spine. This wasn't coincidence. He was following her. Nick didn't wait. He straightened abruptly, gripping the edge of the metal table, then turned to Vin. "She's not living alone anymore. She moves in here." Vin hesitated. "Sir." "She won't agree easily." Nick didn't answer. He knew she would resist. She would question him. She would give him that calm, unblinking stare she saved for moments when he crossed a boundary. But this time was different. This wasn't control. This was survival. That night, when Emily stepped out of the penthouse bathroom, her hair damp, a thin towel draped around her shoulders, she found Nick standing in the center of the living room, not seated, not drinking, not staring out the window like he usually did, standing tense, silent, his hands in his pockets, half his face shadowed by the light behind him. "Is something wrong?" she asked. He looked at her for several seconds before answering in a low voice. "Someone is following you." She froze. Her face remained calm, but her hands tightened around the towel. "I'm not important in your world, Nick. It could be a coincidence." "It's not," he said sharply. "He followed you twice. From the laundromat, from the grocery store. That's not coincidence. That's surveillance." Emily stayed quiet. For a long time. Then she lifted her chin, meeting his gaze head on. "And what do you plan to do?" "I already did," he answered. "You're moving in here. Tonight." She stared, lips parting as if to protest, but then she exhaled slowly. "This isn't a request, is it?" He stepped toward her. No mask, no distance, no pretense. "No, it's not. This is a command. I won't leave you alone. If someone thinks they can get close to you without me knowing, they'll pay for it." Emily turned away, walked toward the window. The city below glowed like a quiet sea of gold. She didn't argue. She didn't shout. She didn't push him back. In that moment, she understood that the lines they once respected had faded, and for the first time, it wasn't because he wanted power. It was because he feared losing her. Emily sat on the edge of the guest room bed Nick had prepared earlier that day. The room was large, elegant, refined in every detail, but everything felt foreign. The thick rug beneath her feet, the oversized bed, the perfectly arranged pillows, even the faint scent of the room felt unlike her. She didn't speak when Nick entered, simply watched him from across the room. "How long do you intend to keep me here?" Nick leaned against the doorway, the light behind him casting half his face in darkness. "You're not being kept. You're being protected." Emily let out a small, weary breath. "I never asked for protection. I can take care of myself." He stepped closer, his voice lower. "You don't understand. This isn't about whether you can take care of yourself. This is about your safety. You're being followed, maybe more than you realize. I won't wait until something happens to act." She stood abruptly, moving toward him until only a few steps separated them. "And what about me? My opinion? Do I matter at all? Or am I just something you need to keep in your sight like everything else you control in this world?" He looked straight at her, unflinching. "Yes, I control many things, but you're not one of them. If I wanted to control you, I would have done it long ago." Emily let out a soft, shaky laugh. "Then how do you explain the bodyguard, the driver, the cameras, the demand that I move here?" Nick clenched his fist, then forced it open. His voice softened, deep and certain. "I'm not protecting you because you're an employee. I'm protecting you because I care." The words fell between them heavier than any order he had ever given. Nick had never explained himself to anyone, not once in his life, but standing in front of her, he had no choice but to speak the truth because if he stayed silent even one more second, he knew he would lose her in a way no power could fix. Emily stared at him for a long moment, her breathing uneven not from fear, but from something else entirely, something that made her heart stutter. For the first time, his confession wasn't rooted in control, but in something real and fragile. She turned halfway, gripping the back of the nearest chair, her voice raw. "I don't know how to react to that. I don't live in your world, Nick. I don't know how to exist in it." He stepped closer, close enough to hear the uneven rhythm of her heartbeat. "I'm not asking you to fit into my world. I'm trying to pull you out of it. I just need time to make it possible." She froze, not because he promised to change, but because he admitted he was trying. He wasn't dragging her into his darkness only to abandon her. He was carving out a safe corner for her, even while he remained in the shadows himself. She turned fully toward him, her eyes softening. "I don't need you to love me. I just need to know that if one day I walk out of here, I won't be held like an object." Nick nodded, his voice hardly above a whisper. "If that day comes, I won't stop you. But as long as you're here, no one touches you. No one." Emily lowered her gaze, saying nothing more. But inside her chest, a wall she had spent years building cracked open just enough for light to seep in. And for the first time, she didn't feel imprisoned in that penthouse. She felt sheltered, and though she wasn't ready to say it out loud, a part of her no longer wanted to leave it all. Emily's phone vibrated late in the afternoon while she was rearranging the bookshelf in the penthouse living room. Noah's name appeared on the screen. She answered immediately. But only silence came through at first, followed by a low male voice, unfamiliar, cold, and chillingly calm. "If you want your brother to stay alive, tell Nick Moretti to back off. We don't want money. We want the message delivered. No police, no tricks. You have 6 hours." The call ended abruptly, leaving Emily frozen in the middle of the quiet room. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her hands trembled, and a cold numbness spread through her entire body. She didn't remember how. She got to Nick's office only that she burst through the door, nearly screaming his name. Nick looked up, and the moment he saw her face, he knew something catastrophic had happened. "Noah. They took Noah. They called me." She barely finished before he was on his feet. His eyes darkened, his expression pulled tight like a bowstring. He snatched the phone from her hand and replayed the message. The voice flooding the room made every muscle in him go rigid, his jaw clenching hard. "Get Vin. Form a team. Prep the cars. We leave in 20 minutes. Emily stared at him, her voice breaking. "They don't want money. They said they want to send you a message." Nick didn't respond right away. He was calculating. In his mind, enemies and motives unspooled, who had the nerve to kidnap the brother of the one woman he had been guarding more fiercely than anyone else, who knew exactly how much Emily meant to him, and chose this moment to strike. He turned to her, and his eyes no longer held the cold detachment he showed everyone else. Something raw, stripped of all armor, had surfaced. "You're not going anywhere. Stay here." Emily shook her head as tears spilled down her cheeks. "No, I have to go. That's Noah. I can't sit here and wait." Nick stepped closer, placing both hands on her shoulders. "Emily, if this is a trap, I won't let you walk into it. I've lost too much to take that chance." But she pushed his hands away, and in her eyes he saw something he had never seen before, an unshakable fire. "You taught me to trust actions, not words. I'm not someone you hide behind a door when things get dangerous. I'm Noah's sister. I won't leave him alone." Nick stared at her. 1 heartbeat. 2. Then he nodded. "Then you stay by my side. You don't leave my sight. Not for a second." Emily nodded through her tears and followed him out. No one spoke in the car. Nick checked his weapon, speaking briefly to Vin about the traced location, a deserted warehouse in the old industrial zone by the East River. 4 SUVs cut through the thick rain. The night pressed against the windows like a cold, suffocating curtain. When they arrived, Nick stepped out first, his hand on the gun at his hip, scanning the shadows. Emily climbed out beside him, her heart thudding painfully. She had never stepped into a world like this where decisions were made without words, where a life could vanish in a single glance. But she didn't shake, not even once. The warehouse door was kicked open by Vin, the metal echoing through the cavernous dark. Inside was nothing but shadows, until a beam of a flashlight swept across the space. Footsteps echoed against cold steel walls. Then a soft sound from a far corner. A body tied to a chair, head slumped, mouth gagged. "Noah." Emily screamed his name and lunged forward, but Nick caught her arm, stopping her until his team swept the room for threats. When he finally nodded, she ran to her brother, hands shaking as she untied the ropes. Noah was alive, bruised, battered, but conscious. Relief shattered through her in one overwhelming rush. Nick turned away, gun still in hand, but for the first time in his life, true fear pulsed through him, not fear of an enemy, but fear of how close he had come to losing the one person who made him willing to risk everything. Noah was loaded safely into the SUV. His bleeding stopped, though his body still trembled in Emily's arms. She held him close, whispering to him, perhaps to soothe him, perhaps to keep herself from falling apart. Nick stood outside the vehicle, gripping the gun that had fired twice in the chaos minutes before. The warehouse was secured, the two kidnappers neutralized, one gravely wounded on the concrete floor, the other tied to a rusted pillar. Nick didn't bother looking at them again. Every part of him was pulled toward the woman sitting in the back seat, her face streaked with dirt, her hair tangled from the rain and wind, but her eyes shining so fiercely it nearly hurt to look at her. She had been there when he drew his weapon. She had not flinched when a bullet sliced the air near her head. She had shielded her brother even before the gunfire stopped, and she hadn't asked a single question, hadn't panicked, hadn't behaved like someone who didn't belong. She was part of this moment, part of this world he never imagined letting anyone into. As the SUV pulled away from the industrial wasteland, silence settled over them. Emily sat in the middle, holding Noah close, while Nick sat beside her, unable to take his eyes off her. Not to check for wounds, but as if committing her to memory, as if anchoring himself to the reality that she was still here. When the cars stopped outside the secluded estate, Nick used as a safe house, he instructed Vin to take Noah inside. Emily moved to follow, but Nick caught her hand. He didn't speak, he simply held on. She turned, exhausted, her expression softened by relief and fatigue. The wind outside carried the scent of wet soil and pine, brushing against her skin. Nick stood before her, soaked, towering, a smear of blood across his cheek from shattered concrete, but his eyes were no longer the eyes of a mafia king. They were the eyes of a man standing at the edge of the one thing he could no longer control. He didn't ease into it, didn't choose a moment, didn't prepare a speech. He simply looked at her, breath still heavy, and said the two words she least expected. "Marry me." Emily froze, lips parting, eyes widening as though she didn't trust her own hearing. Nick didn't give her time to question it. He stepped closer, until she could feel the warmth of his breath in the cold night air. "Today I came closer to losing everything. If you hadn't been there, I don't know if I would have made it out. And if I ever have to live another day like this without knowing you're mine to come home to, I'd rather not live at all." She stood motionless. The rain had stopped, but the air was damp, and her heartbeat felt painfully tight in her chest. She thought she understood Nick. She thought whatever existed between them was unnamed but undeniable. But this proposal delivered in the quiet after a storm, with the night still trembling around them, made the ground shift beneath her feet. "Are you sure?" she whispered, the words soft but shaking with the weight of everything they'd just survived. Nick nodded without hesitation. "More certain than anything I've ever commanded. I don't want you to be mine. I want you to be family. A home. The reason I fight." Emily looked into his eyes and finally saw what she had sensed all along, not possession, but love. Rough-edged, unpolished, fierce, but real enough to take her breath away. She didn't nod, but she didn't walk away either. She stepped closer, placed her hand on his chest where his heart was still pounding, and whispered, "I need one day to breathe. One day to know this isn't an illusion created by adrenaline after a gunfight." Nick closed his fingers around her hand, his grip gentle yet unyielding. "You can have a lifetime. Just don't walk away from me." She didn't promise, but for the first time, she let her hand rest in his unhurried, unafraid, unmoving. And in the quiet of that late hour, without another word, they both knew something irreversible had begun. Emily did not leave the upstairs room of the estate for the entire next day. Nick respected that. He didn't call, didn't knock, didn't disturb her, only left a tray of food outside her door, still warm each time she opened it to look. But Emily didn't eat. She sat by the window, staring out at the forest, slowly shifting color in the autumn wind, her mind empty but her heart beating with a relentless, uneven rhythm. His proposal would not leave her thoughts, nor would the look in Nick's eyes the night before, when he spoke of loss of fear, of not being able to keep her safe. But there was one thing keeping her from saying yes, even though her heart had already leaned toward him. It was the question that had existed from the very beginning when Nick knew too much about her, when everything around her quietly began falling under a gentle yet frightening form of control. By late afternoon, She found him in his office, sitting at the same large wooden desk, bathed in warm yellow light, a half-filled glass of liquor by his hand. He looked up when he saw her standing in the doorway. "I have a question," she said with calm resolve. Nick nodded. "I know." He stood, not avoiding what he knew was coming. He walked toward her, close enough that nothing between them could be hidden anymore, but not close enough to intimidate. He spoke slowly, his voice low and steady. "I investigated you before you ever stepped into my apartment." Emily wasn't surprised, but she stayed silent, waiting for the rest. "I received your file through the cleaning company I've worked with for years. You were new. Your background was clean, too clean. No one switches from teaching to custodial work without a reason." I couldn't ignore that. Emily's hands tightened slightly, but she didn't interrupt. He continued. "I had people follow you. Check where you lived, your family, your past, even Noah's medical history. I knew you weren't honest about why you stopped teaching, and I knew you lost your mother to abuse. I knew everything." She inhaled slowly. "And you still hired me? Even knowing I didn't belong in your world?" Nick nodded, eyes steady on hers. "Because the moment I noticed you, I knew I wouldn't be able to let you go. Not out of curiosity, but because I saw something in you I've never seen in anyone else. Someone who walked into my home without looking me in the eye, without fear, without trying to please me. You worked, you left, as if my existence meant nothing. I was used to attention, to caution. But you weren't like that, and that is what pulled me in." Emily was silent for a long time. The room was filled only with the ticking of the wall clock and the soft wind pushing through the cracked window. Finally, she spoke gentle but resolute. "So from beginning to end, I never had a choice. Everything was decided before I ever walked in." Nick shook his head. "No, I could investigate you, but I couldn't force you to make me fall in love with you. That happened before I realized it. When you smiled at Vin, when you teased me with that note, when you stood in the kitchen at midnight cooking eggs, when you ran to Noah without caring if a bullet was coming. I have no control over my feelings. And for the first time in my life, that terrified me." Emily looked at him for a long moment, then turned slightly away. "I still need time." Nick nodded. "I'll wait. As long as you need. But when you're ready, I hope you know. One thing, I don't love you because you're special. I love you because you're the only person who has ever made me want to become someone else. Not a kingpin, not a man of power. Just a man who knows how to love and would give up everything if you asked." She didn't answer. But when she left the room, her eyes were far wetter than they had been all afternoon. And Nick knew her answer was closer than ever. The next morning, the sun rose late after a long night of rain, its first light filtering through the thick trees behind the estate, casting soft beams over the damp stone steps. In the east room, Emily stood before a mirror, wearing a simple white dress that hugged her slender frame. No lace, no extravagant train. Just a thin ribbon tied loosely at her waist, and a hairpin she had chosen herself. Everything happened quietly. No guests, no photographer, no grand celebration. Only Nick's most trusted people stood scattered across the garden beyond the terrace. An elderly priest, once a close friend of Nick's father, had come to perform the ceremony. Even Vin, whose stern expression rarely shifted, stood a little straighter today, his eyes betraying a hint of emotion as he watched Emily from a distance. She walked slowly along a stone path covered in white petals. No one escorted her, no one at her side. But every step was steady, every breath clear, because at the end of the path, Nick was waiting. In a simple black suit, his gaze locked onto her with unwavering intent. He didn't smile broadly or speak in flourishes, but the way he looked at her as if the entire world had paused to witness this moment sent a tremor through her chest. When the priest asked Nick Moretti if he accepted Emily Sanders as his wife, he answered without hesitation, his voice deep and decisive, like every important choice he had ever made. When he turned to her, something softened in his eyes, revealing what no file or background check could ever capture in that hardened heart. "Do you accept, Emily?" She looked at him, and all the chaos of the past months passed through her mind like a reel of memories. The cold apartment in the city, the first time he looked at her as if she were invisible, the arguments, the long nights worrying about Noah, and the moment she almost lost him in a hail of gunfire. She nodded. "I do." No tears, no wavering, but inside her chest was a vow stronger than any ceremonial blessing. When the ceremony ended, there were no cheers, no applause. Only the soft rustle of wind moving through the trees and an inexplicable peace in a world she once believed she could never belong to. But as they walked out of the garden hand in hand, the eyes watching them shifted. Respect turned to scrutiny. Curiosity turned to caution. They looked at her as an enigma. She was no longer the quiet cleaning woman in a luxury penthouse. She was now the wife of Nick Moretti, a woman with the authority to sit beside men who once bowed before her. Husband. Someone whose words could change the direction of negotiations. Emily felt the shift in every nod she received, every glance half reverence, half fear. She wasn't afraid of it, but she understood that from this moment on, every step she took would be watched. Every word she spoke would carry weight, not only for her, but for the man standing beside her. That evening, when Nick led her into the room they would now share, he didn't say much. He simply removed his jacket and hung it on the wooden hook with the same quiet habit he had carried his whole life. Then he turned toward her, gently cupped her face, and looked into her eyes as if still trying to believe it was real. "Are you afraid, Emily?" She pressed her hand over his and shook her head softly. "I'm not afraid of you, but I'm afraid of anything that could take you away from me." Nick pulled her close, holding her in a fierce, grounded embrace. "You will never lose me. Not as long as I breathe, not as long as I can protect what matters most." And in his arms, in the quiet of that room, Emily knew that no matter how the world outside shifted, in this moment she had become an irreplaceable part of Nick Moretti, not because of a title, but because of his heart. The days following the wedding passed like a dense, quiet fog, soft, still, and unsettling in its silence. Emily lived in Nick's main estate on the outskirts of the city, far from car horns, crowded streets, and the curious eyes of the world. No one entered without passing through 3 layers of security. No door lacked a fingerprint scan or a coded lock. Each morning when she woke, the first faces she saw were not Nick's, but those of 2 men in black suits standing a few steps apart in the hallway. They didn't speak, didn't meet her eyes, only gave a curt nod, as if programmed to perform the gesture. When she went down to the dining room, breakfast was already set. Every slice of bread cut with perfect symmetry, every cup of coffee at precisely the temperature she preferred. But no one sat with her. No clinking of cutlery, no casual greetings. Only a kind of well-intentioned silence that felt like a wordless symphony, precise, predictable, and cold. Nick still cared for her, but he was sinking deeper into his work. Meetings took place behind closed doors. Names were mentioned only in coded numbers. Decisions were made without discussion. She didn't ask questions, but she heard enough. She heard the low timbre of Nick's voice issuing orders. She heard Vin's heavy footsteps each time something went wrong. She heard doors open after long phone calls, and felt the weight in Nick's gaze grow heavier by the day. She had once thought the underworld was a place of chaos, guns, midnight chases, explosions in alleys. But the truth suffocated her far more. It was the absolute silence, the flawless control that revealed no cracks, no warnings, no escape routes. Danger didn't arrive with noise. It arrived when no one knew it was coming. One late afternoon, when she tried to step out to the back garden, the sliding glass door hadn't even opened before 2 guards approached, one gently blocking her path, the other pressing a hand to his earpiece. Emily paused, looking between them. "I just want to take a short walk." One of the guards spoke quietly, polite yet offering no room for negotiation. "The area is being inspected. Please return inside for a few minutes, ma'am." Ma'am, the way they said it chilled her. She was no longer Emily. She was a title bound to Nick's power, an extension of the system itself, and it made her feel more alone than she had ever been. That evening, when Nick returned home, she waited for him in the library. The room was full of books, each shelf carved from heavy oak, but none seemed to carry the breath of life. They were decorations, like everything in this place. When Nick entered, he looked exhausted, but his eyes softened the moment. He saw her. He walked over and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You didn't eat dinner?" She lifted her head, her voice steady. "I wasn't hungry." Nick sat beside her, taking her hand. "Are you all right?" Emily met his eyes. "Your world is too quiet. I don't hear laughter. There are no children, no noisy neighbors, no unexpected knocks at the door. Only wood, stone, guns, and nods." He was quiet for a few seconds, then exhaled. I know. I've lived like this for a long time. But you haven't. She nodded. I thought I could adapt. But some days I don't even know if I'm still myself. Nick tightened his grip on her hand. I don't want you to change. But I don't know how to keep you safe without making you feel trapped. She leaned her head against his shoulder. I don't need you to make everything perfect. I just need to hear you tell a simple story. See you laugh at something silly, not because a deal went well, but because something genuinely amused you. Nick nodded slowly, his gaze softening. He didn't make promises, but he would learn, because Emily had never been part of the plan. She was the most beautiful accident his life had ever handed him. And for her, he was willing to let the silence of this world be broken, even if only by the small, ordinary joy between them. The next morning, when Emily stepped out of the bedroom, she immediately sensed something different. Vin no longer stood guard in the hallway. Instead, two unfamiliar men in dark suits were in his place, rigid as statues, tension in their gaze barely concealed. In the dining room, her breakfast was set as usual, but on the table lay a satellite phone and a stack of marked documents, as though someone had rushed out mid-meeting. Nick wasn't there. No note. No message. Emily sat, holding her warm cup of tea without drinking. She listened. The mansion felt quiet, but not with the usual quiet. It was a waiting quiet, a quiet that felt like a storm gathered in the walls, needing only a spark to break. Around noon, she heard the faint sound of a helicopter from far away, but by the time she reached the back terrace, everything had gone still, as if nothing had happened. Nick didn't call. He didn't text, and that was unlike him. She knew something was wrong, everyone was simply choosing not to tell her. Late that night, when Nick finally returned, he went straight to his office instead of coming to her. Emily waited until the light inside switched off before she knocked and entered. Nick was taking off his jacket, his shirt stained with patches of dried blood. He turned when he saw her, eyes tired but voice gentle as always. "You're still awake?" She looked at him, not bothering with pretense. "What's happening?" He hesitated, then shook his head with deliberate calm. "Nothing serious. Some internal trouble. I'm handling it." She stepped closer, studying him. Then why were there strangers filling the find? Shifts today? Why was my breakfast paired with a secure phone? And what is that blood on your shirt if it's nothing serious? Nick held her gaze for a long moment. He wasn't surprised she noticed. He simply didn't want her carrying the weight he could carry alone. A new group, young, with money, trying to climb fast, testing boundaries, setting traps, threatening people close to me, sending anonymous messages to my safe houses. Emily's hands tightened, her voice lowered. "And you didn't think I should know?" Nick stepped closer, his hand brushing her cheek, gentle but protective. "I just wanted you to feel peace. My world isn't a place you should live in fear." Emily stepped back half a pace, her voice calm but deeper than before. "I didn't choose to live in your world to be protected like a child. I chose to live with you because I thought there was respect between us. Respect isn't hiding the truth. Respect is sharing it, even when it's heavy." Nick inhaled, his shoulders sinking with the weight of understanding. "I've never had anyone beside me long enough to consider that. Everyone before you was a subordinate, a soldier, a partner. I spoke, and they obeyed. You're the only person who's ever made me stop and wonder if I should tell the truth." Emily's voice softened, though not weakly. "I don't need every detail, but I need to know when I am in danger. I need the chance to choose how I face this world, not be locked behind walls you think are safe." Nick nodded slowly, as if each movement cut through an old instinct. He understood. He had spent too many years handling everything alone, forgetting that someone was now walking beside him. "From now on, I won't hide anything from you. Even if the truth makes me afraid you'll leave." She stepped forward, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, weighted rhythm of his heart. "I'm not afraid of danger. I'm afraid of being kept outside the life of the man I love." And in that moment, Nick realized something profound. Real love wasn't about keeping someone safe by building walls around them. It was learning how to walk through the storm together, hand in hand, eyes facing the same direction, respecting both their fears and their courage. Night fell slowly, the last traces of daylight dissolving into a pale gray sky, leaving the estate wrapped in a deep, resonant stillness broken only by the wind slipping through the pine trees and the muted glow of the hallway lights. Emily stood by the window, holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold, her gaze drifting into the distance as though searching for something just out of reach. She had grown used to the silence of this place, but tonight it didn't make her feel lost. Tonight she felt expectant. Nick's footsteps sounded behind her, slow, steady, familiar, the way he always approached when she was submerged in her own thoughts. He didn't speak at first, simply stood there for a moment before his hand came to rest gently on her shoulder. Emily turned, her eyes softening as she looked at him, his face shadowed with exhaustion, his hair slightly more disheveled than usual, but his gaze stripped of the heaviness that had haunted him for days. She set the cup down and moved closer, and without needing words, they settled together on the sofa, the fire casting warm amber light across their faces. Nick held her gaze for a long, quiet moment, as though gathering the courage to speak. When he finally did, his voice was rough but steady. Today, there was a moment when I heard gunfire by the old warehouse. Just 1 second, Emily, just one. And I thought you'd been hit. It felt like someone drained all the blood from my body. Like everything stopped. He swallowed hard. I've watched people die. I've ordered deaths. But I've never been afraid, until that moment. Emily said nothing. She simply reached for his knee and gave a gentle squeeze. Nick took her hand, lowering his voice until it was nearly a whisper. I can lose everything, money, power, reputation. I can rebuild all of that. But if I lose you, I won't survive it. I don't know if a man like me deserves to be loved. But I know one thing. None of this means anything without you. Emily blinked, tears rising not from pain, but from the raw truth he had finally placed in her hands. In everything Nick had done and said, this was the first time he laid his heart bare before her, unguarded, uncalculated, vulnerable. She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath his shirt. I'm here, Nick, and I'm not going anywhere. But I need you to remember this. I don't want to be your weakness. I want to be your strength, a reason for you to live, not something that makes you lose yourself to fear. Nick wrapped his arms around her as if she were the most precious thing he had left in the bodied world. He took a long breath, then whispered, You've never been my weakness. You're the only thing keeping me sane in all this chaos. That after everything, something beautiful still exists, beautiful enough to make me want to live differently. They stayed like that for a long time, neither needing to speak. Outside, a soft rain began to fall, each drop tapping gently against the roof like the steady heartbeat of the night. In the warm room, by the crackling fire, they leaned into each other not as two people bracing against the world, but as two souls who had finally found their safe harbor in a storm that never truly passed. And there, in that quiet, there was no Mafia, no power, no cold decisions, only two tired, wounded human beings who had chosen to love with a sincerity their world had never understood. Nick was still asleep when dawn crept in, his breathing slow and warm against her shoulder, one arm draped around her, as though even in dreams he feared she might slip away. Emily lay still, her eyes open, fixed on the ceiling glowing with early golden light. She no longer felt sleepy, but she didn't want to move. Something inside her was shifting gently, like a deep undercurrent stirring without force, but with enough truth to reach the very bottom of her heart. Ever since she stepped into Nick's life, she had asked herself many times if she was taking too much of a risk, if love alone could ever bridge the impossible distance between their two worlds. Nick was a man feared by an entire city, a name that made even the coldest criminals reconsider their choices. He held power, influence, the ability to move within a system untouched by law. But he was also the man who had stood before her, soaked in rain, eyes almost desperate, simply because he thought he might lose her. The man who confessed fear not to the world, but to a woman with no money, no army, no leverage, nothing but a sincere heart. She remembered the first time she met him, his gaze sharp as steel, his voice quiet yet capable of freezing the room. She had thought she would work for a few months and leave. She had never imagined that one day she would see that same man on his knees, in a moment of smoke and gunfire and panic, whispering two simple words, "Marry me." Nick had never been perfect. He controlled, he hid things, he made decisions for others, He grew up in a world where trust did not exist, where loyalty was purchased through fear or money. But he was also the man who learned to listen to her, to change piece by piece so she wouldn't feel like something locked away. She had never seen him laugh freely until she teased him in the kitchen. She had never seen him flustered until he tried baking with her and forgot to turn on the oven. And she had never seen him tremble until he held her after a moment where they almost lost each other. She thought of her mother, a woman who spent her life with a man, who never put anyone above himself. She had once vowed she would never repeat that mistake, never love someone she had to shrink herself to fit beside. But with Nick, she didn't shrink. Somehow, it was her presence that made him grow. Not because she demanded it, but because he chose it. And for the first time, she felt certain. I'm not marrying a perfect man. The thought came to her like a familiar whisper, a truth she should have understood long before. I'm marrying a man who would give up everything because of me. Because of my smile. Because of my peace. Because of the trust I place in him, even when the world sees him as something to fear. She turned to look at Nick, his sleeping face softer, younger, stripped of all defenses. Not a kingpin, not a feared leader, but a wounded man learning how to love and be loved in ways he had never been taught. She brushed her fingers through his hair, whispering silently, I'm here, and I will stay. Not because I need protection, but because I believe that this time, love is the strongest thing we have. Nick shifted slightly, as if he felt the words even in sleep. Outside, the first morning light spilled across the windowsill, stretching gently into the room where two imperfect people were learning, piece by piece, how to be perfect together. Late in the afternoon, as the city slipped into the soft amber glow of sunset, Nick and Emily sat together on the balcony of the top-floor penthouse in Manhattan, where every light below them slowly flickered on, each window pane reflecting fragments of the hurried lives moving beneath their feet. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They simply sat in silence, hand in hand, their eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky was beginning to darken. After all the chaos, the conflicts, the misunderstandings, the near losses that could have changed everything forever, they chose to sit beside each other in this quiet moment. No more defense strategies. No more doubt. Just two people, seasoned and scarred, finally accepting that they could no longer exist apart. Emily rested her head on Nick's shoulder, her breath steady and deep. Nick placed his hand gently over hers, a silent reminder that whether in the light or in the shadows, whether surrounded by power or stripped down to loneliness, he was here and he would always be here. Deep inside, they both understood that life would never be perfect, and that a person didn't have to be perfect to deserve love. Nick was not the ideal man by any traditional measure. He had spent nearly half his life in a world where laws were written in blood, where emotions had no place, and trust was a luxury no one could afford. And Emily, an ordinary woman carrying the scars of her past, only wanted a place to call home, someone genuine enough for her to entrust her whole heart to. It was their imperfections that made them fit so perfectly together. Neither tried to change the other. They learned to accept, to listen, and most importantly, to walk beside each other, even when the road was anything but easy. Perhaps the greatest lesson in this story is that sometimes the most precious thing isn't what is perfect, but who chooses to stay, who protects you, loves you, and stands beside you even when everything else is falling apart. Real love doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to show up with the right person, at the right time, with a heart steady enough to walk through the storm. If you've made it this far, take a moment to ask yourself, are you willing to love someone not because they are flawless, but because it is their very imperfection that makes you want to walk with them to the end? We would love to hear your thoughts about this story. Did it touch your heart? Did it remind you of someone in your own life? We truly hope you'll share your feelings with us, your honest reflections, your quiet emotions, so we can understand what resonates deeply with the people who follow our stories. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share to help spread more heartfelt stories like this every day. We'll continue bringing you real, soulful journeys, stories of people standing between darkness and light, between painful choices and unconditional love. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. Wishing you good health, a peaceful life, and days filled with warmth and simple joy. We'll see you in the next video. Goodbye for now.